Are there technical reasons a Ruby DSL like spec couldn't be rewritten in Python? The section below goes into more detail, but basically someone stated that the Ruby written DSL spec couldn't be rewritten in Python. Is that true? If so, why? I'm wanting to better understand the technical differences between Ruby and Python. Update: why am I asking this question? The running away from spec discussion has some statements about it being impossible to recreate spec in Python. I was trying to make the question a little broader in hopes of learning more of the technical differences between Ruby and Python. In hindsight, maybe I should have tightened the question's scope to just asking if it truly is impossible to recreate spec in Python, and if so, why. Below are just a few quotes from the running away from spec discussion. Initial question. For the past few weeks I have been thinking a lot about spec and why there is no clear, definite answer when someone asks. I'm looking for a Python equivalent of spec. Where can I find such a thing? Probably the most common, and understandable, answer is that Python syntax wouldn't allow such a thing, whereas in Ruby it is possible. First response to initial question. Not syntax exactly. Spec monkey patches every object inside of its scope, inserting the methods should and should underscore not. You can do something in Python, but you can't monkey patch the built-in types. Another response. As you suggest, it's impossible. Mote and PySpec are just fancy ways to name your tests, weak implementations of one tiny corner of spec. Mote uses horrible Cetrus magic, PySpec adds a bunch of domain-irrelevant noise. Neither even supports arbitrary context strings. Spec is more terse, more expressive, removes the noise, and is an entirely reasonable thing to build in Ruby. That last point is important. It's not just that spec is possible in Ruby, it's actually idiomatic.
If I had to point out one great difficulty for creating a Python spec, it would be the lack of a good syntax in Python for creating anonymous functions, as in JavaScript, or blocks, as in Ruby. The only option for a Python programmer is to use lambdas, which is not an option at all because lambdas just accept one expression. The do ... blocks used in RSpec would have to be written as a function before calling describe in it, as in the example below. Not so sexy, right? There are some difficulties in creating the should methods, but I bet it would be a smaller problem. Actually, one does not even need to use such an unusual syntax. You could get similar results, maybe even better, depending on your taste, using the Jasmine syntax, which can be trivially implemented. That said, I feel that Python syntax is more focused on efficiently representing the usual program components such as classes, functions, variables, etc. It is not well suited to be extended. I, for one, think that a good Python program is one where I can see objects, and functions, and variables, and I understand what each one of these elements do. Ruby programmers, Odo, seem to seek for a more prose-like style, where a new language is defined for a new problem. It is a good way of doing things, too, but not a Pythonic way. Python is good to represent algorithms, not prose. Sometimes it is a draconian limit. How could one use BDD, for example? Well, the usual way of pushing these limits in Python is to effectively write your own DSL, but it should really be another language. That is what Pycuracy is, for example, another language for BDD. A more mainstream example is Doctist. Actually, if I would write some BDD Python library, I would write it based on Doctist. Another example of Python DSL is Twill. And yet another example is restructured text, used in Sphinx. Summarizing, IMHO, the hardest barrier to DSLs in Python is the lack of a flexible syntax for creating anonymous functions. And it is not a fault. Python is not fond of having its syntax heavily explored anyway. It is considered to make code less clear in the Python universe. If you want a new syntax in Python, you are well advised to write your own language, or at least it is the way I feel. Or maybe it is. I have to confess that I miss anonymous functions. However, I recognize that they would be hard to implement elegantly given the Python semantic indentation.
I set out on an attempt to implement something like RSpec in Python. I got this. Source, this URL. Thoughts? Edit. My answer to your question is that the lack of anonymous blocks prevents a Ruby DSL like RSpec from being rewritten in Python, but you can get a close approximation using with statements.
One of Ruby's strengths is in the creation of DSLs. However, the reasons given for it being difficult in Python can be sidestepped. For example, you can easily subclass the built-in types, e.g. if I were going to create a DSL in Python, I'd use for parsing or parser and something like the above behind the scenes, optimizing the syntax for the problem, not the implementation language.
By mixing Mamba and expecs, I think you can get very close to what RSpec is for Rails. This URL. This URL. Also, I think Spectre should match your expectations with testing. This URL. This URL.